Chapter 17 of Tension by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 17. "A very cold north wind," said Sir Julian, entering the room set ready for a general committee meeting. "Damnably cold," said Mark Easter, who never swore. Sir Julian made an elaborate rearrangement of the pencils and blotting paper on the table in front of him, and then looked at Mark. They were the first arrivals. Mark's gaze met Sir Julian's, but it was unusually clouded. "I don't know what's the matter with this place," he said irritably. "What's happened?" "Nothing at all that I know of. It's just in the air. Fuller's like a bear with a sore head, and those two women, Farmer and Sandiloe, whispering together in corners and exchanging glances like conspirators in a gunpowder plot. What on earth is the matter with them all?" There was silence, and then Mark said, still in the same irritable voice, "I suppose they think one's a perfect fool. If I've had one of them in my office this morning, I've had half a dozen, on the flimsiest excuses you ever heard of in your life. I don't know what they expected to find there, I'm sure." If Sir Julian could have enlightened his agent on the point, he did not do so. But he became himself very acutely aware of the state of tension pervading the college during the course of the committee meeting. Mark, contrary to his usual habit, scarcely spoke at all. Mr. Fuller sat with a face like a thundercloud, and looking up occasionally under his closely knitted eyebrows, fixed inscrutable eyes upon Miss Marchrose opposite. She looked tired and nervous, and Sir Julian remembered that it was less than a week since he had thought her looking beautiful at Iris Easter's wedding. Edna, he noticed, did not glance at Miss Marchrose, but from time to time her eyes rested thoughtfully upon Mark Easter. Even Alderman Bellew, far from susceptible to shades of atmosphere, struck Sir Julian as being vaguely and uneasily watchful. The meeting was poorly attended, and when it was over, Mark said rather doubtfully to Lady Rossiter, "You'll have some tea before you go, won't you?" "Thank you," she said graciously. "Only if you're quite sure that it wouldn't put anyone out, give any extra trouble." "I can find out the state of the commissariat first, if you like," he rejoined, and left the room. Miss Marchrose had gone already. Edna's manner altered to one of businesslike determination on the instant. "I'm going to make a little suggestion," she said clearly. The Alderman looked up, and at the same instant Fairfax Fuller took 2 steps forward. "It isn't perhaps a very easy thing for me to say," Lady Rossiter said unfalteringly, "but we all know one another here, and I believe, oh, so intensely, in having courage. But never mind that. I needn't go into any details. But it's this. I think the general feeling amongst the staff is that there might be some slight alteration in the duties of the Lady Superintendent. They don't altogether like her doing so much. It's natural enough, isn't it? Perhaps they feel that inordinately long hours, kept by one person, cast a slur upon the others who don't seem to be quite so devoted. Perhaps she hasn't been very tactful about it. I don't know about that, but at all events, couldn't we give her a holiday from evening work for the present? Let her go at about 4 o'clock? The Alderman's prawn-like eyes were fixed admiringly upon Lady Rossiter, but he said nothing. Sir Julian spoke. "You can't make an invidious distinction of that sort, Edna. It would be impossible." "But she looks very tired," said Edna smoothly. "She has certainly been doing too much. We can put it on that score." "Who has been objecting to the hours that Miss Marchrose puts in?" demanded Fairfax Fuller bluntly. Edna's little smile admirably blended a protest at the question and a quiet determination to leave it unanswered. "Because," said Fuller. "If you'll be good enough to tell that person to address his or her complaint to me, Lady Rossiter, I'll deal with it in the proper way. I never yet heard of a good worker being sent off duty early because a slack one didn't like the sight of overwork." "Come, come, Fuller," said the Alderman uncertainly. Fairfax Fuller turned a black gaze upon him that actually caused the old man to move his chair backwards. "Leave it alone, Edna," said her husband. "If there's jealousy amongst the staff, Fuller is quite right in saying that he's the person to adjust it. They had no business to appeal to you." "You force me to speak plainly," said Lady Rossiter. "It isn't only a little jealousy, though there is that as well, but, to put things exactly as they are, the staff doesn't like the habit that Miss Marchrose has fallen into of staying on overtime till all hours and then being taken home. And frankly, I don't think you can blame them. That sort of thing isn't done. It makes talk at once."
"Evidently."
The fury in Fuller's voice was hardly suppressed. "I believe that I am not censorious," said Lady Rossiter. "It is utterly foreign to my nature, and I would sooner blind myself to evil than look out for it. Yet there are things which go against one's every instinct. This is a very little community, and it has always been a very peaceful and happy one. It hurts me very much, somehow, that there should be talk of the kind that I know has been going on lately."
"Mischief-making," muttered Fuller, fiercely, and without completing his sentence. "Officiousness is the curse of the age," exclaimed Sir Julian, neither for the first nor the second time. "Why can't people mind their own business? What has it to do with them?"
As he spoke, some part of his mind commented upon the futility of these disjointed exclamations, and the irrationality of the desire to gain time that had caused him to utter them. The three men gazed at Lady Rossiter. "Oh, how I hate saying it!" she cried in an impulsive manner. "It isn't that I think there's any harm in it at all. Indeed, I don't. But I myself have seen little things, tiny, infinitesimal incidents, if you like, that somehow seem to carry significance by repetition. That sort of thing doesn't do." She looked at her listeners for an instant, and made inevitable selection amongst them. She turned to the Alderman appealingly. "I'm only a woman, but I know that sort of thing doesn't do in business offices. Isn't that true?"
"Quite true, Lady Rossiter," said the Alderman instantly. "It's an undesirable sort of element altogether. And once people start talking, especially a lot of girls, if you'll excuse my saying so, it's hopeless. It ought to be got rid of."
Edna hesitated a moment, then she said, Shall I speak to poor Miss Marchrose? It might be easier for another woman to do it, and I don't think she would resent it from me." Two, at least, of those present might reasonably have received this assertion with a considerable amount of surprise, in view of certain past incidents apparently shrouded in complete oblivion by the forgiving Lady Rossiter. The Alderman was less responsive this time.
"It's very good of you, Lady Rossiter. Very good indeed. I'm sure we all appreciate your keen interest in the welfare of the college and the staff. But at the same time, I don't know."
He stopped rather helplessly. "You mustn't think of me," gently said Edna. "Just speak out, quite frankly, and tell me what would be best for everyone. Anything I can do, you know."
"The fact is, it's least said soonest mended in these cases," blurted out the Alderman. "The girl had better go. Don't you agree with me, Sir Julian?" "It will probably end in that."
There was a certain surprise visible on Lady Rossiter's face as she heard her husband's reply. "It's her livelihood," she reminded them. "We mustn't forget that." But at the same time, the college interests come first, and the one thing to be avoided at any cost is a crisis. So much can be done by staving things off."
"The doctrine of expediency," inaudibly muttered Julian through his teeth. It was a doctrine that never failed to rouse him to wrath. Fairfax Fuller's deep, angry voice broke out suddenly. "I should like to know what the girl is being accused of, that we should send away the best worker we've ever struck."
No one replied until Edna said solemnly, "I accuse no one."
"I beg your pardon, Lady Rossiter, but it's too late to say that now. The girl has been accused, and she knows it, and everyone else knows it. The whole thing is in the air. The place stinks of it," said Mr. Fuller with reckless candour. "There was some talk of my being sent off to Gloucester on business, but I don't leave this place until this mess is cleared up. Why, the atmosphere is like a barrel of gunpowder, simply waiting for a lighted match."
"Then why light it, Mr. Fuller?" sweetly enquired Lady Rossiter. "Why insist upon having things put into words?"
"Because it's common justice," said Mr. Fuller doggedly. "We can't send the girl away without giving her a reason, and there isn't a reason to give that I can see."
"The question will rest with the directors, surely," Lady Rossiter reminded him. She looked straight at Alderman Bellew.
"She'll know fast enough what the reason is, without being told," the Alderman gloomily supported the lady. "She's not a chicken. A girl with any business experience knows very well that this sort of thing isn't tolerated in any office. Nothing serious, of course, as Lady Rossiter has just said, but it makes talk, and it won't do."
Fuller swung round and faced the Alderman.
"I'd like to have the sort of thing you've just alluded to specified. I'm supervisor of this staff, and I've nothing against Miss Marchrose."
"As you have been reminded," pointedly said the Alderman, also becoming heated, "the question rests ultimately with the directors."
"Then my position here is a farce," the supervisor retorted.
"Anything but that, Mr. Fuller," said Edna earnestly, and with the evident intention of laying a soothing hand upon his arm. Fuller almost backed into the wall in his avoidance of it. "Indeed," said Lady Rossiter pleadingly, "no one minimises your position here, nor the responsibility that rests upon you with regard to the staff. But you force me to say something that I would much rather leave unsaid." Sir Julian wondered whether it would be of any use to ask her to do so, and decided that it would not. "I used to hear about this poor creature years before she ever came here. It isn't the first time that there's been trouble." Sir Julian's eyes almost involuntarily met those of the Alderman as this pregnant announcement fell upon the air. He interposed in a level voice. "My wife means nothing that is derogatory to Miss Marchrose, Mr. Bellew. We are, however, in a position to know that a few years ago she broke off an engagement of marriage under circumstances that were certainly painful, but perfectly honourable to herself. That matter, of course, concerns her private life and has nothing whatever to do with the point at issue." "Excepting this, Julian," his wife said resolutely, "that a girl who has once put herself into a false position of that kind is liable to do the same sort of thing again."
"She may get engaged to the whole office one after the other and chuck them the next day for all I care, so long as she does her work properly," said Fuller, quite as resolutely as, and a good deal more vehemently than, Lady Rossiter. "It would scarcely be good for the office generally," replied Edna dryly. "Now, my dear fellow," began the Alderman, "you must look at this matter in the light of reason. The greater good of the greater number, you know. This young woman mustn't be allowed to upset the office." "She hasn't done so."
"On your showing, Mr. Fuller," said Lady Rossiter, very much in the tone of one endeavouring to reason with an idiot. And, to quote your own words of a few moments ago, the whole thing is in the air. Everybody is upset and disturbed because it is impossible for anybody to give out reckless and excited and undisciplined thoughts and emotions without their having an effect upon his or her surroundings. It is—
I've yet to learn," Mr. Fuller interrupted, without the slightest ceremony, "that a first-class worker can be dismissed on account of thinking."
Fuller, 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 bleated the Alderman in an expostulatory tone.
"We can discuss this later on, Fuller," said Sir Julian wearily. "Sir Julian, I prefer to make my attitude perfectly clear to you at once," began Mr. Fuller with great vehemence, when Mark Easter came back into the room. Although the inopportuneness of an abrupt silence striking through the excited conversation that had raged a moment before was evident to the point of blatancy, an immediate dumbness fell upon everyone as the door opened before Mark. To Sir Julian's perception, it was oddly significant that Mark, after one quick glance from face to face, should remain silent and unsmiling, asking no questions. It was the woman present who haltingly broke through the awkward pause. "We were just wondering if there was to be any tea for us. A committee meeting in the afternoon is so unusual for the college, isn't it? We hardly know ourselves when it isn't the ordinary 11 o'clock meeting." "There's tea in Miss Marchrose's room," said Mark. He spoke without expression.
"Oh, thank you," said Edna from pure nervousness, and walked out of the room. Sir Julian followed her, partly from sheer desire not to be confronted with his infuriated supervisor, and partly from a wish to see Miss Marchrose herself. She passed them in the passage, and Edna inclined her head without speaking and walked on. Sir Julian stopped.
"Are you coming to give us some tea?" he asked her.
"Yes. No, I don't think so," she said confusedly, her pale face colouring unmistakably. Sir Julian felt vaguely disappointed. He had expected that the consciousness of antagonism in the air would have roused in her a certain latent defiance, already dimly foreshadowed in her erect bearing and abrupt, defensive phraseology. But she was looking tired already, and frightened, as though she realised herself to be very much alone.
"Are you busy?" he asked.
"I am, rather." She looked at him doubtfully, and once more he saw the shadow of fear, unmistakable, in her dark circled eyes. He did not know what else to say, although he felt very sorry for her, and he thought that for a moment she seemed about to say something further. But she only opened her lips for an instant, and then turned away without speaking.
"Goodbye," said Sir Julian lamely.
"Goodbye." He waited thoughtfully outside the college for Lady Rossiter, nor did the entertainment of afternoon tea prolong itself. She came out, followed by Mark Easter.
"Will you have a lift, Mark?" "Thank you, I've got one or two things to finish here."
Julian, being well aware that at this Edna was endeavouring to exchange with him a sudden, meaning glance, became instantly absorbed in the mechanism of the car. "Mark, don't do that. Do come back with us now," said Lady Rossiter earnestly, and irresistibly and quite involuntarily reminding Sir Julian of the heroine of a certain type of fiction pleading at the door of the public house. "Bill, come home with me now." He stifled the ribald association and started the engine.
"You'll walk back then, later?"
"Come back with us, Mark," repeated Lady Rossiter. Sir Julian opened the door of the car. "Why are you in such a hurry?" demanded Lady Rossiter resentfully, in an undertone.
"Perhaps we could wait for you, Mark, if you're only going to be a little while."
"I'm afraid I shall be longer than that," said Mark, looking harassed.
"That's all right," said Sir Julian firmly,
and took his seat in the driver's place. Lady Rossiter reluctantly stepped into the car beside him. They saw Mark turn into the college again as the car moved from the door. "I am utterly exhausted," said Edna. Her husband, according to his wont, made no response, and she presently spoke again. "Couldn't you feel the tension in that place, Julian?" "Yes." "You're not a fanciful person, perhaps not even a very perceptive one, and certainly Mr. Fuller is neither, yet both you and he were on edge. I could see it and feel it." "And hear it too, I imagine, so far as Fuller was concerned," said Sir Julian, not without reason. "One does not expect very great self-command from a man of his type. But I'm frightened, Julian, I tell you honestly. You know how extraordinarily susceptible I am to the influence of a thought form." "Of a what?" said Sir Julian, having heard her perfectly, but being desirous of venting his own sense of uneasiness in ill temper. "Perhaps I used an out-of-the-way expression, but you know what I mean, surely. On another plane, one that is perhaps not so far removed from our own as we sometimes think, these things are classified. I've no psychic gifts myself," said Edna, in a modest way that positively seemed to imply a certain distinction in the absence of those attributes. "But undoubtedly there are those amongst us who can absolutely see and translate into terms of colour and shape for the rest of us." "I feel sure that the colour and shape of any thought form belonging to Fuller at the present moment would repay inspection," said Sir Julian grimly. "Ah, poor Mr. Fuller. It hurt one, didn't it? Prejudice and violence and ignorance, the three great foes that we, who can see a little further into the great, wonderful heart of life, have to fight against all the time. But sometimes it does feel as though all one's love and pity were being flung back upon oneself again, as though a hard wall of resistance were opposing everything." Edna gasped a little. Her husband wondered so much whom she supposed herself to have been loving and pitying that afternoon that he felt constrained to ask the question aloud. "But all of them?" Edna, usually undemonstrative, flung apart her hands in an expressive gesture. "How can you ask, even? The pity of it all, Julian. That was what wrung my heart. Oh, Julian, be careful!" Sir Julian, most skilful of drivers, had sent the car swerving recklessly round the sharp corner of Culmhayes Drive. "I beg your pardon, Edna." Both were silent till the house was reached. The topic that occupied them both, however, was revived that evening. This time Edna approached it from a less exalted point of view. "It's very curious how much these people absorb one's thoughts. And yet, of course, it's not curious at all. They're fellow creatures, after all. Sometimes I think the old alderman is quite right. The best thing would be for Miss Marchrose to go. I wish she would resign of her own accord." "I think," said Sir Julian, "that there is every chance of your wish being realised." "Why?" "It's a question," said Sir Julian very distinctly, "of exactly how long she can stand her ground. She is a very intelligent person, and unless I am greatly mistaken, a very sensitive one, and my own opinion is that she will be defeated early in the day by the mere atmospheric pressure against her." "You mean that she will feel, without having it put into words, that things can't go on as they are at present?" "It wouldn't need very keen perceptions to have come to that conclusion already." "Perhaps not." Lady Rossiter spoke thoughtfully. "You see, the one thing one doesn't want is to have things put into words." Sir Julian, disagreeing with her even more completely than he usually did, answered nothing. "It's Mark I'm thinking of principally. At the present moment I honestly believe that Mark, who is exceptionally simple, hardly realises that anything has upset the college. Certainly he won't attribute it, yet, to the way in which that unfortunate young woman has been behaving." "Why should he attribute it to her behaviour any more than to his own?" Sir Julian reasonably inquired. "It usually requires the behaviour of two people to start this sort of idiotic gossiping." "Mark has been foolish, I daresay," coldly said Lady Rossiter. "All men are alike in these matters, and when a woman hurls herself at a man's head, you can't expect him not to take a certain amount of advantage." "Of what exactly has this hurling consisted?" demanded Sir Julian, with an air of judicial impartiality. "You have seen quite as much as I have," Lady Rossiter mistakenly informed him. "She never has a civil word for anyone else, and she's perfectly brazen in boasting of the amount of extra work she does for him. She haunted the estate office when that other girl was ill, and took over her typewriting work in the calmest way. Of course it was practically impossible for Mark to refuse when she insisted, and of course there's her fashion of getting him to walk home with her after dark every night." "And all this would be perfectly legitimate and desirable, if only Mark's dipsomaniac was in a better world instead of this one," was the thoughtful resume of Sir Julian. A resume of which the wording, if not the substance, found so little favour in his wife's hearing that she had instant resort to the inevitable Roland with which it was her custom to counter his time-honoured Oliver. "If you remember anything at all of that miserable affair that went so near to wrecking poor Clarence Isbister's life, you can hardly say that." Sir Julian wished for no recapitulation of the oft-told tragedy alluded to. "I remember perfectly. He battered his head against the walls of his nursing home, and I think any girl was well rid of him on that account alone." Lady Rossiter rose with great quiet. "I am going to bed. It has been a strain altogether. But after all, I shall feel it's been worth anything, whatever it may cost me, if only one can stave off any sort of disastrous crisis. It seems to me that at the moment the one thing to be avoided is definitely putting things into words." "Plain speaking?" enquired Sir Julian. "It is, on the contrary, the one thing that I should really like. But don't be afraid, Edna. We shan't get it, unless it's from Fuller." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Tension by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 18. Sir Julian's desire for plain speaking was more amply gratified on the following day even than he had anticipated. He had purposely made an early appointment at the college in order to discuss with Mark and the supervisor the question of the journey to Gloucester. But he was aware that a curiously strong sensation of anxiety constituted an underlying motive for his presence there. There flashed across his mind the dim recollection of a conversation in which he had taken part with Mark Easter and Miss Marchrose one afternoon on the way from Salt Marsh to Culmhaze. They had agreed in their estimate of the potency of an atmosphere. He thought it was Miss Marchrose herself who had said that the worst times are when nothing at all has happened, and yet everything is happening. Prophetic, reflected Julian, half amused. He made his way slowly to Mark Easter's room. A feminine voice, lowered to that penetrating sibilance which most infallibly attracts the attention which it is designed to escape, reached his ears. "And she knew I was looking at her too. I could tell she did by the way she coloured. You know, and I never said a word, simply looked at her, you know, Don't let me disturb you, I said. Like that, quite quietly.
Sir Julian pushed the half-open door. Miss Farmer and Miss Sandiloe stood in close confabulation just inside the room.
Oh, good morning, Sir Julian.
They both looked much confused. Good morning, he said gravely. Mr. Easter has not arrived yet.
No, said Miss Sandiloe, ever ready of speech, in spite of her manifest discomfiture. No, he hasn't. He very often gets in rather later these mornings.
I can wait, said Sir Julian. It's not 10 o'clock yet. Miss Farmer began to sidle towards the door. Her companion followed her, but was inspired to turn round and add an unnecessary rider to her last observation.
Mr. Easter is always here so late in the evenings now, too, she remarked artlessly as she went out of the room.
Sir Julian heard a nervous giggle as the door closed behind them both, and he thought that Miss Farmer ejaculated something that sounded like, "However you could, Sandiloe." If Miss Marchrose has been up against that sort of thing for the last week, was his unformulated thought. A further example of that sort of thing confronted him in the entrance hall, where he presently betook himself restlessly. 3 girls, all of them pupil teachers at the college, with young Cooper, the financial secretary, stood near the notice board. Their necks were craned forward, and their eyes, expressive of curiosity, suspicion, and a certain excitement, were unanimously following the tall, slight figure of Miss Marchrose as she disappeared towards the distant classroom. "Good morning," said Sir Julian, with extreme abruptness and in tones not usually associated with a morning greeting. Everyone jumped violently. The 3 pupil teachers disappeared with celerity, and Mr. Cooper turned a brick-red countenance upon his chief. "Just looking at the notice board," he said in an affable manner. "There appears to be nothing on it," Sir Julian made rejoinder, with equal obviousness, but in a voice that was not without point. "Nothing at all," agreed Mr. Cooper, rather feverishly, and running a hand across the green baize square as if further to demonstrate its bareness. "I see you're in early, Sir Julian." "I have an appointment with Mr. Easter, but I'm rather too soon. Fuller is in class, I suppose?" "Yes, Sir Julian. Let me see." Cooper produced his wristwatch. "I'll look at the time. Yes, he'll be in class for the next 3/4 of an hour. Shall I send for him, Sir Julian?" "No, thanks, I'm in no hurry. There's just the question of the place to be opened at Gloucester. You've heard about it, haven't you, Cooper?" "Oh, yes, Sir Julian. The whole staff has been much interested, and very proud too, if I may say so. I'd even thought... I don't know if I may venture." "Are you a candidate for the job of going down there next week?" Sir Julian asked, smiling. "Not myself," said Mr. Cooper. "I may even say, Sir Julian, that I doubt if I could be spared at the moment. We have 1 or 2 French scholars, and the accountancy is particularly heavy just now. Of course, it's what you wish, Sir Julian, but I hardly think I could leave at present, even for a day or 2. But I was wondering whether I might venture a suggestion." "Certainly," said Sir Julian, rather astonished. "It has occurred to me," remarked Mr. Cooper with a certain pompousness, "that Miss Marchrose would not be at all unfitted to do what's required, and a little change might be rather a good thing for her in its way, Sir Julian." "Indeed." "There's been a certain amount of feeling, I'm afraid, just lately." "I should like details, if you please." "One hardly likes to say anything," Mr. Cooper began, with great and evident satisfaction. "She's a splendid worker, as you know, Sir Julian, and the other young ladies took to her quite wonderfully from the start. Quite foolish, 1 or 2 of them were about her, but the fact is, if you'll excuse my mentioning it, she has been rather indiscreet of late." "Go on," said Julian in level tones, as Cooper waited apparently for some sign of encouragement. "The fact is, to put the whole matter in a nutshell, some of them have got talking. You know what that means, especially with 1 or 2 rather excitable young ladies."
There was a pause, during which Julian recollected Mr. Cooper's old-time predilection for the society of Miss Sandiloe. She hasn't made any secret of liking Mr. Mark Easter's society very much, and she's given him a good deal of hers. That's all it amounts to, said Mr. Cooper, with a great effect of frankness. He has found her useful for some of the extra work. No doubt, Sir Julian, that's all it is. But she's in that office of his nearly as often as she's in her own. And then they've been late a good many evenings and stayed on here working after the college was supposed to be closed. It was also known, Sir Julian, that the present Mrs. Douglas Garrett, Miss Easter, that was, used to ask Miss Marchrose to her brother's house a good deal when she was home. We are not in the least responsible for what the staff may do out of hours. Certainly not, Sir Julian, and of course we all know and like Mr. Mark Easter, and I've no doubt that he's never said a word to her that we mightn't all have heard. But somehow, said Mr. Cooper, with a fatalistic expression, somehow the staff have got talking. It doesn't concern them in any way whatever. Those were my very words, Mr. Cooper replied impressively, my very words when one of the young ladies approached me on the subject. This is an affair which concerns no one but Mr. Mark Easter, I said, and you may be sure that he will deal with it in the best manner possible. In fact, I said, if this unfortunate young lady has forgotten the circumstances of the case, we may be quite sure that Mr. Easter will himself take an early opportunity of reminding her. Mr. Cooper's tone implied that no more triumphantly satisfactory denouement could be hoped for. And do you suppose that he has done so? Inquired Sir Julian, from sheer curiosity to hear Mr. Cooper's reply. Cooper shook his head from side to side. I couldn't say at all, Sir Julian. There's been a very uncomfortable state of things prevailing for the last few days altogether. I couldn't put a finger on any one thing, not to give a name to it, but there's constraint, Sir Julian, and we all feel it. This has always been such a friendly little party that one can't help noticing, like. I shall be greatly obliged, Cooper, said Sir Julian with deliberation, if you would check this tittle-tattling as far as possible. It is extraordinarily objectionable. Cooper looked far from hopeful. She'll have to pull herself up, as it were, or else leave altogether, Sir Julian. Otherwise I don't see what's to prevent the staff from getting talking. Sir Julian perceived that no amount of words would remove from Mr. Cooper his conviction of the inevitability of the calamity which he described as the getting talking of his fellow workers. I shall think the matter over. Certainly we can't have this sort of atmosphere in the place. It's upsetting everyone. That is so, Sir Julian. It's the talk that's doing the harm, said Mr. Cooper solemnly. Certainly it is. I hope there will be no more of it. Sir Julian's hope was uttered for rhetorical purposes merely. His never very sanguine outlook had been in no way illuminated by the eloquence of Mr. Cooper. Don't let me keep you any longer, Cooper. I know you're busy. Thank you, Sir Julian. If you'll excuse me, my watch. 10 minutes past. Then I'll go straight to classroom 3. Up the stairs. Mr. Cooper hurried away, taking 2 steps at a time. Sir Julian's discussion with Mark was completed rapidly enough. I'm quite ready to see this Gloucester affair through, said Mark, looking out of the window. Fuller doesn't seem anxious to take it on. Can you spare the time? Easily. Today is Friday. What about Monday? Right. Mark said nothing more. The tiny furrow between his eyes had deepened a very little. They spoke of business for a little while, and then Sir Julian left Mark in solitary possession of the small office. As he came away, he encountered Miss Marchrose. Her observation was worthy of Mr. Cooper. I'm going to the high-speed room, she said with evident nervousness. Are you giving another test there? Oh, no. We're very slack at present. The last lot have gone out and we mostly have beginners. But I want to put some things away. She was quite evidently defending herself against some unspoken accusation. As she turned away, she looked back at Sir Julian, again with that suggestion of wishing to say something further. "What is it?" he asked, almost involuntarily. "Nothing," said Miss Marchrose, her voice catching in her throat. Sir Julian walked away slowly. "Sir Julian," she said, rather breathlessly. He turned at once. Are you just going?" "I am in no hurry." He reflected for an instant and then decided to take her wishes for granted. "You'll find me in the annex. There's no hurry, so take your time about putting the papers away. I'll wait for you there," said Sir Julian calmly. He waited barely 5 minutes. She came into the room, very erect, with tension in every line of her face and figure, and a little dent coming and going at the corner of either nostril. She shut the door quietly behind her. "Sit down," said Sir Julian, placing a chair for her so that she could lean both arms on the table and steady a certain tremulousness of which he suspected the existence. In order to give her time, he slowly and carefully took out and lit a cigarette. He was conscious of a sensation of surprise in the midst of his mingled annoyance and compassion. He had not expected her to acknowledge defeat so quickly, and he wondered whether some element of which he knew nothing had been introduced into the invisible contest against her. "I think I shall have to ask you to accept my resignation," she said at last, in a sort of rush. "I'm sorry," said Sir Julian carefully. "I've spoken to Mr. Fuller about it, but he was a little difficult." "I can quite believe it." "I couldn't get him to accept my resignation at all," she said, smiling rather forlornly. "Fuller is not easily defeated." She interpreted his thought rather more accurately than he desired in her quick rejoinder. "And I am. I haven't been able to cope with the last few days at all. Do you remember how we talked about atmosphere one afternoon before Christmas?" "On the way back from Salt Marsh. I was thinking about it not so very long ago." "Then," said Miss Marchrose slowly, "you knew about this place?" Sir Julian made no pretence at not having understood her. "I know that it has afforded a rather poignant example of the very thing we discussed that afternoon," he replied. "I thought you knew," she said, pushing her hair away from her forehead with a rapid, nervous movement. "But you see, I'm in the dark. No one has said a single word to me. I'd so much rather that they did." "Yes, I can understand that. But you see, no one is in a position to say a word to you except, officially, Mr. Fuller as supervisor." "Then why hasn't he?" Miss Marchrose demanded, a sudden colour flooding her pale face. Sir Julian said nothing, for the conclusive reason that he could think of absolutely nothing to say. "He told me today that my services had been perfectly satisfactory and that he didn't want me to leave." "I know he doesn't." "In that case," said Miss Marchrose, "I must place my resignation with you direct, Sir Julian." "Have you definitely decided to resign?" "I'm afraid so," she said, colouring suddenly. Sir Julian once more kept silence from a helpless sense of the impossibility of any discussion, although intuition told him that she was more or less blindly in search of a safety valve for her perplexities. She remained in her chair for a minute or two, looking down at the table, and only a very slight, involuntary movement of her fingers betrayed the tension of waiting. Sir Julian paid the penalty sooner or later exacted on all those whose perceptions are acute, in realising with vividness her sense of bafflement as he remained mute. With a sort of remnant of the pluck that he had always credited her with, she rose at last and said, "Thank you very much, Sir Julian," quite steadily. He rose also and opened the door, and she went out. Sir Julian remained more than ever convinced that some very forcible factor, of which he was still unaware, had entered the lists against her and definitely defeated her. "It's no business of mine," he reflected to himself almost violently. Nevertheless, he had more to hear upon the subject that same afternoon. He met Alderman Bellew, whose discursive comments were not to be stayed. "Easter's a very nice chap, you know," said the Alderman sapiently. "I don't like the idea of this young woman making a fool of him. He's not been looking himself for the last day or two. Didn't you think him a bit off colour at the general meeting yesterday, now? I can assure you that he didn't look himself to me. He looked—" The Alderman lowered his voice in a very impressive and mysterious manner. "He looked worried." Sir Julian felt inclined to ejaculate, "You don't say so," at this bit of penetration, but the Alderman went on. "It's not to be wondered at either. I don't know whether you've noticed a sort of disturbance lately in the college. Something in the air." "I know what you mean," Sir Julian said, truthfully but non-committally. "Exactly. Just what Lady Rossiter was speaking of the other day. Well, now that sort of thing won't do, will it? It upsets the staff, upsets the work, upsets that chap Fuller badly. Took it very much to heart, didn't he? I suppose he thinks it reflects upon his credit as supervisor when things go wrong with the staff. However, it's all quite easily put right when all's said and done." Such not being the comfortable conviction of Sir Julian, he waited for further enlightenment. "The girl can go." "Oh," said Sir Julian. "Yes, the girl can go, of course." "It needn't affect her references in any way," said the Alderman, apparently made uneasy by something in Sir Julian's tone. "Certainly not." "There's no harm in the girl, I daresay, though I don't like what I hear of those antecedents of hers." Sir Julian was perfectly well aware that Miss Marchrose's antecedents, so far as Alderman Bellew's knowledge of them was concerned, rested upon the slender fabric of the hints thrown out by Lady Rossiter on the subject. He therefore remained unresponsive, and Alderman Bellew presently, with an air of rather puzzled reluctance, abandoned the subject. "It's no business of mine," Sir Julian told himself with increasing vehemence, as his perception grew of the strength of the league that was so successfully fighting the shadow of a possibility. Even Culmhayes was pervaded by unrest. Edna was silent all through dinner, except when the servants were in the room, when she discoursed in an elevating way about the first breath of spring and a tiny twitter which she said that she had heard in the beechwood that afternoon. Sir Julian heard about the twitter towards February or March every year, and received the news of it with modified enthusiasm only. As soon as they were alone, Edna drew a long breath, flung her head back, and said with a sort of restrained ardour, "Julian, whom do you suppose I met this afternoon in the beechwood?" "The first squirrel of the year," suggested Sir Julian with perfect indifference. "I am not laughing." "Neither am I. Do you mean a human being or a harbinger of spring?" "I met Mark," said Lady Rossiter very gravely. Sir Julian peeled a walnut attentively. It seemed, I say it in all reverence, like an answer to prayer, for I had prayed over it all, Julian. I was miserable. I could see all the tangle and perplexity so clearly, and yet I felt bound and helpless. I could do nothing to help or hinder. Julian reflected detachedly that his wife did herself less than justice. "And then I met Mark, and I knew as soon as I saw him that it was my opportunity for helping. It is so curious, when one has formed the habit of looking for little opportunities, how the big one is sure to come sooner or later. Mark wanted help badly, Julian." Lady Rossiter waited for a moment, during which her husband remained motionless, and then went on, speaking in slow, even tones. "I believe in courage, as you know, most intensely. It is so difficult sometimes to break through our conventional reserve. It was so today. But I spoke. Mark has no woman in his life."
"I can hardly agree with you, in the circumstances," muttered Julian grimly, but his wife disregarded the interruption.
"And there are times when a man wants a woman to whom he can speak freely. Oh, I didn't hurt his chivalry in any way. I respect it far too much. Nothing was put into words between us, practically. But everything was implied."
"At the moment, Edna, I prefer words to implications, as I am very much more likely to understand them. What did you say to Mark?"
"Very little," said Edna, with a dignified simplicity that failed entirely to convince Sir Julian of the accuracy of her statement. "But, thank God, I believe I have made certain that there will be no debacle, such as one could not help dreading. I was in terror that that unfortunate girl should try to force an issue." Sir Julian realised, with a slight shock of surprise, that his wife's estimate of Miss Marchrose's capabilities of enterprise were identical with his own. Edna, he reflected, did not yet know that Miss Marchrose had, to all intents and purposes, most unmistakably hauled down her colours when she had tendered her resignation to him that morning.
"How are you to prevent her from forcing an issue?" he asked.
"It's so simple. Mark is going away on business, and he leaves on Saturday instead of on Monday. A week makes a long break, Julian, in a case like this, and she will either understand why he has gone without being told, or she will find her position intolerable and leave the college. Even if she stays on, though I think it impossible that she should, they will begin again on a very different footing. Mark understands now."
"Understands what, in heaven's name?"
Edna raised her eyebrows and made a significant gesture.
"Mark goes tomorrow?"
"Yes. Thank heaven I made him see that there is greater courage in turning one's back sometimes than in facing a danger. Every day that passes, as these last days have passed, the risk of an explosion becomes greater. It's like skating over a volcano."
"Nobody ever does skate over volcanoes,"
said Julian, almost automatically. His mind was working rapidly. Mark was turning his back. As Edna had said, it might be the greater courage. There would be no crisis. Nothing had happened, and nothing would happen. A crisis, indeed, must have spelt disaster, Sir Julian told himself mechanically, all the while with a sense of somehow having missed a clue. The next moment he had found it. His original instinct with regard to Miss Marchrose had been right. She had, in all probability, known whither she was drifting, and she had been prepared to face the rapids gallantly. But Mark... Julian dropped his metaphors and envisaged crude facts. Mark, after all, had himself been responsible for the determining factor that alone could have vanquished her courage utterly. Fully alive to the awkward situation, Mark Easter had inevitably conveyed to the girl, whom Sir Julian, more than ever, qualified as an incurable romanticist, the illimitable difference in their scales of relative values. And it was that certainty that, reaching her in the atmospheric tension of the last few days, had defeated Miss Marchrose. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Tension by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 19.
"You're going this afternoon, Mark, after all?"
"If you've no objection, Sir Julian."
My dear fellow, I am always trying to persuade you that Saturday afternoon and Sunday were not meant for work."
Mark laughed, not sounding very much amused.
"Report progress after you've got there, and let me know when you're likely to be back."
Mark nodded. Sir Julian put his hand upon the younger man's shoulder with a gesture of intimacy unusual to him.
"Don't hurry back."
"Thanks very much," said Mark, with equal brevity and sincerity. As Mark Easter went into the estate office, whither Sir Julian had driven him, he looked round with the smile that, after all, never altogether failed him.
"I might get some good golf down there." "Yes," Sir Julian assented gravely, after an instant's pause. "You might get some good golf down there. I hope you will."
He did not go near the college that morning, but found himself wondering very much whether or not Mark had done so. Instinct, rather than conscious volition, took him that afternoon down to the sea wall to find Miss Marchrose. Mark had gone, and she herself would leave the college, probably before his return, and Sir Julian thought that it would not matter very much now if he offered her such solace as could be afforded by his understanding, complete as he felt it to be, of their wordless drama. It was an afternoon of West Country weather, and the very spray was misty and soft as it curled upwards from a grey, still sea. This time there was no high wind to contend with, as on the day when they had walked the length of the sea wall, and she had told him about her life in London and the story of Clarence Isbister. He could discern her slim figure braced against the wall as he crossed the sand dunes and came towards her. When she turned her face to him, he saw with a shock that was not altogether surprise that it was pale and blurred with crying, and that her eyes looked as though she had been weeping all night. The faint, elusive beauty, such as it was, had left her face altogether. But her voice, veiled with exhaustion, retained all the quality that gave it charm. She said, with rather tremulous directness, "I thought that perhaps you'd come. I was hoping you would."
"Then I'm glad I came," said Sir Julian. "Are you warm enough sitting here?"
"Yes, I think so. I don't want to walk. I'm tired." It was obvious that she was very much tired indeed.
"I am very sorry," said Julian simply,
and his tone implied a deeper regret than the compassion that he felt for her evident fatigue. "You're going to let me talk about it now, aren't you?" she asked, with a sort of childish urgency in her voice.
"Anything you like, or that is of any use to you,"
he replied levelly. The necessity of self-expression is singularly strong in human nature. Sir Julian surmised that the only outlet in the case of Miss Marchrose's vehement and highly strung personality lay in the exercise of a certain gift for elementary sincerity that made of her words something more than self-analytical outpouring. "He has gone away," she said tonelessly. "But even before he went away, I knew how it all was. I have been the most utter fool. You could hardly believe what a fool I've been. You know I told you the other day that I'd hardly ever been happier than I've been here."
"I remember."
"Well, even then I half knew that it was because of him. And very soon afterwards I knew it quite. And it seemed to me that I couldn't stop myself. The thing I cared about was doing work for him and being with him. And just at first it didn't occur to me that it would ever be anyone's business but mine. I mean, I never thought that anyone would notice, or that it would matter if they did." Sir Julian thought of his own crusade against the thing that he termed officiousness. "But of course," said Miss Marchrose, "I've had experience of business life, and I knew that in any office the sort of things that make talk can never be tolerated for a minute. It's always stopped at once. Generally they send the woman away. And I thought that very likely that would happen to me, sooner or later.
And you didn't mind. I understand, said Julian.
No, I didn't mind, she repeated forlornly enough. I seem to have got to a place where I can't feel ashamed of anything. Otherwise, I suppose that I shouldn't be telling you this.
I think, said Julian slowly, that you can put that idea of shame quite out of your mind. It has always struck me as a very much misapplied emotion. There is nothing to be ashamed of in anything that is true. The only thing that is shameful is pretence. You are talking to me now on a plane where pretence can have no possible existence, and therefore, if it is of any help to you, go on speaking what is in your mind. I can do nothing for you, but I am here, and I will listen to you, and I shall never repeat to any living soul those of your thoughts which you choose to speak aloud in my hearing.
He leant over the wall, gazing with absent eyes at the grey expanse of sea that his soul loved, and remained immovable. "You're quite right," she said. "I want to speak about it. I do want to speak about it. Rather like that day when I wanted to talk about Clarence Isbister, and you let me. You do understand, don't you? I knew that Mr. Easter was married. He told me so himself, quite soon. And I heard about his wife a little, you know, from other people in the college as well. At the very beginning I was only just sorry, and then I minded very much, and then after a little while I thought it wasn't going to matter. To him, you know."
"Tell me what you mean," said Julian gently.
"I suppose I mean that, anyway, it wouldn't have mattered much to me. I know that there are these standards of right and wrong. I was taught things, but I knew quite well, really, that they wouldn't have weighed in the balance against happiness. I suppose that's what is meant by an unprincipled person. Somehow I thought that he was going to feel like that too." "I daresay," said Miss Marchrose, simply enough, "that it is because I have never been loved by anyone, except poor Clarence, whom you can hardly count, that I thought that. Such little things seemed to me to mean a great deal. I read indications into things, you know, and all that time they must have meant nothing at all."
"I don't think that altogether," Julian said, entirely against his saner judgment.
"What do you think?" she asked, with a kind of listless curiosity.
"I can only give you conjecture. I know nothing at all, and you see men don't talk to one another much. In this case especially, of course, I have nothing whatever to guide me but my own conjectures."
"Tell me," she said.
"I think he was very much attracted by you," said Sir Julian, with perfect directness, and noted against his will the instant flush of brilliant colour that the words brought to her face. "But Mark has ideals too, you know, as well as principles. If he ever contemplated eventualities, he knew that he had no right to ask you to—"
"To ask of me what I was prepared to give." She finished the sentence calmly.
"Do you know what that would have involved, altogether?"
"Perhaps I do and perhaps I don't," she said indifferently. "The point is that I was prepared to take my risks."
"In any direction?"
"In any direction," she assented, without vehemence.
"I see."
Hers might indeed be the daring of ignorance, but Sir Julian felt very little doubt that she had spoken in perfect accordance with fact as regarded her own capabilities. One by one there filtered through his mind, and were rejected, the arguments that he knew himself entitled to use. What of morality, of Mark Easter's work, of his 2 children? Of a future grey with unspoken possibilities for themselves and for others? Her reckless impulse had not been put to the test, would never be put to the test. Sir Julian let the rest alone. I don't know quite when I first realised that I had been making the people at the college talk, she said, and again she coloured. It was only a few days ago that it began, and then I had that horrible feeling that everything was soundlessly working up to a crisis, and that sooner or later something must snap. You know?
Yes, I know.
It was after Iris Easter's wedding, I think. And at first I was glad that it had come. Oh, you don't know. You can't imagine what fools girls can be. How they can imagine and fancy and plan things till it all seems true, and they try to go on into real life with the romance that they've been living in their dreams and fancies, and it doesn't come true. Mine didn't come true. Even if I was wrong and absolutely wicked even to let myself imagine what I did imagine, it was just as real to me as if things had been all right. It meant just as much to me as it does to a girl like Iris Easter, who knows that the man she cares for can ask her to marry him.
Perhaps it meant more, said Sir Julian.
She gave him a glance of gratitude out of her shadow-encircled eyes. But when the people of the college suddenly began to watch and talk and look at me, then I thought that it was going to... Well, said Miss Marchrose desperately, to give me my chance.
Tell me what happened.
Nothing happened. Only, you see, at the end of 24 hours, I saw that he was, well, just frightened. He didn't want there to be a crisis. He never had wanted it. Sir Julian, who was Mark's friend, involuntarily paid tribute to the truth of her description. Mark had been afraid. No wonder that Miss Marchrose had capitulated after all. The citadel for which she had been prepared to stand siege had been only the flimsiest of castles in the air. The cause for which she had held that no casualties could be too heavy had no existence outside her own imagination. She spoke again. So, though I know I've been crying, in a little while I shall be glad that he's gone. Nothing can ever be worse than the last few days. They're over now.
They're over now, repeated Sir Julian. Do you want to stay on at the college next week, or had you better not go back on Monday at all?
I don't know, she said in a bewildered way. Mr. Fuller has been extraordinarily kind to me, and anyhow I shall be gone before Mr. Easter comes back. I told him that yesterday.
You saw him then?
He came to my office to say good-bye to me. She waited a little, and then said, with something that was half a laugh in her voice, although the tears had welled into her eyes again, he said, "Good-bye, Annie Laurie."
Poor Mark, said Julian in a low tone.
Presently he made her walk, afraid of the sunless spring afternoon for her.
Where are you going to when you leave? He asked her.
London, I suppose. I can get another post there, and this won't affect my references, she answered, unconsciously using Alderman Bellew's phrase.
Let me know if there's anything I can do for you, said Julian, rather hopelessly, neither thinking that there was likely to be anything that he could do, nor that there was much probability of her applying to him. She made her reply with candour. I think you've done everything you can do, Sir Julian. I'm not trying to thank you. Will you leave me here when you go back? I can take you to the farm or wherever you want to go.
I'd rather stay here a little while longer by myself. Then I shall be all right, she said, like a child. He left her. Perhaps, said Sir Julian to himself as he climbed the sand slopes with long strides. Perhaps I ought to have said goodbye, or remember, or God bless you, or something like that to her. But whatever the rights and wrongs of her point of view, her sincerity is worthy of respect,
and I will mock her unhappiness with no catchwords. Poor child.
As he went towards Culmhayes in the gathering dusk, he met a frantically bicycling figure violently urging forward a machine that was devoid of lights.
Fuller? Sir Julian?
Fairfax Fuller came to attention, as it were, with a promptitude that nearly sent him over his handlebars head foremost.
You had better not go through Culmouth at that rate and without a light, surely, said Sir Julian mildly. Can I give you a match? Are my lamps out? Enquired Mr. Fuller negligently.
Sir Julian felt convinced that they had never been lit, but he handed the supervisor a box of matches without observation.
Thank you, Sir Julian. The fact is, said Fuller, with an air of candour, that I'm upset and I hardly know what I'm doing. What's wrong? This resignation, elliptically said the supervisor. My dear chap, I'm very sorry about it, but we've got to make the best of it. I've told Miss Marchrose that we accept her resignation from a week yesterday.
Mr. Fuller groaned.
May I ask, Sir Julian, whether you have any idea where the girl is now? Isn't it Saturday afternoon? Was Sir Julian's rather pointed reply.
Mr. Fuller brushed aside this suggestion of the liberty of the individual.
I'm uneasy about her. I'll tell you quite frankly, Sir Julian, that I didn't like her looks this morning. One never knows. She strikes me as level-headed enough, you know, Fuller.
Mr. Fuller bent down and examined his rear light, but Sir Julian knew very well, by the mere set of his shoulders, that he remained, and would continue to remain, entirely of his own opinion.
I think that's all right now. Just as well not to run any risks, perhaps, easily observed Mr. Fuller, once more preparing himself to bestride his machine. Good evening, Sir Julian. Good evening.
He watched the red glimmer of Fuller's rear light shoot away into the dusk, and then descry a sudden curve.
By Jove, said Sir Julian.
Mr. Fairfax Fuller, guided by some unexplained instinct, had swept away from the road and taken the path that led down to the sea-wall. The incident, for reasons which he did not seek to analyse, rather amused Sir Julian as he went on his way. His thoughts remained occupied round the subject until he entered his own house, to find it in possession of the two most unwelcome guests possible, in the person of Miss and Master Easter.
"Daddy went away at lunch-time, and we're all alone," proclaimed Ruthie, with pathos. "And Sarah said to come and see if Lady Rossiter wouldn't like to invite us to tea."
Sir Julian had his own opinion to the amount of liking bestowed by his wife upon the suggested festivity, but evidently she had fallen a prey to Sarah's unblushing design for dispensing for a while with the society of her charges. "We'll all sit round the table and have nursery tea," said Lady Rossiter, brightly endeavouring to make the best of a situation that, from the Rossiters' point of view, left much to be desired. "Have you any of you heard from Auntie Iris?" enquired Julian.
"She wrote to Daddy, and she sent her love to us. She didn't say anything about that baby," remarked Ruthie in a tone of regret.
Sir Julian felt that Edna could have dealt with Miss Easter's tendency to call a spade a good deal more fully had he not been present. He could almost hear the few strong, tender phrases in which she would have bade the child refrain from the public consideration of such matters of eugenics as now appeared to be engaging her attention. Proceedings varied but little when Mark Easter's children were entertained at Culmhayes. Sir Julian began by indifference, proceeded to annoyance, and ended in a mood but little removed from infanticide. Edna remained forbearing throughout, but became less maternal and more repressive as the necessity for repressment increased. Ruthie monopolised the conversation with as much determination as ever. Ambrose whined quite as much as usual, and surpassed himself in the degree of stickiness to which he attained. And the séance ended with the usual violent quarrel between the two, and their eventual expulsion from the room and from the house. Ruthie rampant and Ambrose in tears, and the inevitable valedictory wish expressed by the host that they should never be permitted to return. Edna said, "Poor motherless children," in a tone that sounded rather more evidently exasperated and less compassionate than she had intended it to sound, and Sir Julian retired to the smoking-room. He remembered presently that Edna probably knew nothing of the complete victory signalised by Miss Marchrose's resignation from the college staff, but he realised that the episode, in all essentials, was already past. That which he termed atmosphere was dissipated, and he knew that it was almost as an afterthought that Edna, that evening, asked him whether Miss Marchrose was going. "Yes, she is." "At once?" "I don't know. I've left her to settle that with Fuller." "She must go before Mark comes back. It's far better so." "I think probably she will." "Julian, I've been thinking about her, and it seems to me," said Edna, "that we must help her. God knows I can judge no one, least of all to condemn, but I think that her weakness and recklessness are going to make life terribly, terribly hard for her, and I, for one, can't see her drift away like that without one effort to help." The depth of Sir Julian's disapproval for the suggested scheme of philanthropy left him bereft of speech. Finally he observed, "In my opinion, Edna, you have done rather too much already. Leave her alone." "What do you mean? Julian, you carry your mania against officiousness too far. Indeed you do. What are we here for unless it is to help one another?" Sir Julian shrugged his shoulders. "I knew the character of this woman before she ever came here. I couldn't help knowing it. I saw her trying to wreck Mark as she nearly wrecked poor Clarence. I believe that I have saved Mark, and I thank God for it, very humbly and very proudly. As for her, I hold no brief against her. I condemn no one, and I seek only to help her. If she cares to turn to me now, all the love that I can give that poor, struggling, feeble soul is waiting for her." "I don't think she will ask you for it, Edna." Sir Julian thought of many things. For a moment he wondered whether he should say them aloud. Then the habit of apathy that had possessed him for a number of years asserted itself anew, and he did as he had almost always done. He left things alone. The episode was past. He told himself so again, with a faint sense of surprise that already it should rank as an episode merely. There had been no calamity, and as Edna had said, nothing had been put into words. He revised the collection of infinitesimal ripples that had momentarily disturbed the atmosphere common to the little groups of people with whom he was concerned. Almost each one had contributed vibrations in a greater or lesser degree. Miss Farmer, Miss Sandiloe, young Cooper, each and all of them had tittered a little, wondered a little, talked foolishly. Auntie Iris, for the life of him, Julian could not feel as angry with pretty, ridiculous Iris as he thought that her folly deserved. Iris, too, had played out her little comedies, her childish attempts at directing the hand of fate. Old Alderman Bellew. Julian gave only an instant's half-amused recollection to the dogmatic condemnations and assertions of old Alderman Bellew. He had merely found it easy to follow the lead given him, after all. On the thought of Edna's many activities, Sir Julian dwelt not at all. Somewhere at the back of his mind lingered the echo of her specious gospel, her creed of giving out. For himself, he preferred to think that the trend of events had been in no way deflected by all that Edna had done and said. The whole had been fated to remain an episode, devoid of climax. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Tension by E. M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Helen Taylor. Chapter 20. Nevertheless, the last word remained to be spoken, and it was destined to be heard by Sir Julian when he made casual inquiry of Fairfax Fuller on Monday morning. "Have you settled the day that Miss Marchrose leaves us?" "Yes, Sir Julian." "Well?" inquired Sir Julian after a moment, as his subordinate appeared quite indisposed to make any further communications. "She's not coming back here at all." "Is that with your sanction?" said the surprised Julian. "I talked it over with her on Saturday evening, Sir Julian." "Then you did find her?" "Down by what they call the sea wall." Fuller, his dark face marvellously heated, looked full at his chief. "I've asked the girl to marry me, Sir Julian," he remarked. Some weeks later, Julian wrote a letter and addressed it to Miss Marchrose in London. "My dear Pauline Marchrose, since you ask for my opinion, I send it to you for what it is worth, admitting that, as you say, I stand committed to a certain degree of officiousness already. That, however, is not the word of which you made use. Thank you, on the contrary, for the expressions that you have selected. I am glad that you are marrying Fuller. He is a good fellow through and through, and the other side of his bulldog tenacity is a very real and dependable loyalty. I think that that loyalty will be of great service to you. And don't think that you are relinquishing the abstract ideal of which we spoke one afternoon down by the sea wall. You were never false to your standards for a moment, and to recognise defeat is not always an implication of weakness. It may, as in your case, denote the courage of a perfectly sincere outlook. Humbug is the only thing to be afraid of. You have eliminated that, and Fairfax Fuller is not prone to illusion or self-deception. Besides, your intercourse took place at a time and in circumstances which admitted the luxury of sincerity. For that, and for the fact that Fuller knows something of the extent of his incredible good fortune, I send you my congratulations, and I wish you luck." Sir Julian paused a long while. The episode was over. His letter was a postscript merely. "Are you coming upstairs, Julian?" said Edna's most forbearing tones, full of fatigue. "Is it late?" "It's nearly 12. It's the servants that I'm thinking of. I hate keeping them up." "It's quite unnecessary to keep any of them up. I am perfectly capable of putting out the lights in the hall without Horber's assistance." "I shall not ring for Mason. I never do ring for her if I'm later than 11 o'clock. After all, it's a very little thing, when once one realises that a maid is a sister woman, when all is said and done." All was so far from being said that Julian, taking up his pen again, slowly added the final sentence to his letter, unconsciously adjusting his speed to words that struck upon his hearing and penetrated hardly at all to his thoughts.
I believe so much in little things, in the immense power of a thought, of a kind glance, of a smile.
If the colonial scheme materialises rapidly, as I think it will, I shall send Fuller out. It is largely owing to his management that we have the funds in hand to extend the branches of the college, and I can see both you and him as pioneers in the near future.
Sometimes I think that when one has not received very much oneself, it only makes one readier to give. One knows the lack.
Keep up a very good courage. But that, I believe, you will always do. You have got your scale of relative values clear, and once that's done, you can afford to accept truth. Nothing else matters.
Perhaps one would be less tired at the end of the day if one gave out less. But, after all, it's all part of the great, wonderful, divine plan. Have you finished writing, Julian? Jorrocks is on the table.
Yes, quite finished, said Sir Julian, and first signing his name, he sealed his letter. Cornwall, January 1919. Surrey, June 1919. End of chapter 20. End of Tension by E. M. Delafield.